time traveled way back to the turn of the century. And it sounds like a long time ago, right? It was 17 years. I did the math in my head. Back at the turn of the century, I was a coder. That was what I did. I programmed for a living, and it was a dream, and it had finally come true, and I was very excited about it. I was at an organization that did not really care much about coders. They sort of said, here's your little cubicle, and we found this old Dell lying around, and you can use that, and let us know when the coding is done. And I think that was actually a pretty common experience back then. Even at the height of what was then the dot-com bubble, programmers in general were not actually a discipline that was as respected as you might imagine, given how much money was sort of sloshing around in different industries. And I stumbled across a blog. I was a blogger, and so the community of people that were blogging at the time was very small. And I stumbled across a blog from a guy that had started a company called Fog Creek Software. And that was Joel Spolsky's blog, Joel on Software. How many of you have ever read a Joel on Software post? I should hope so, right? That guy's pretty good. He should start blogging again. And I just was struck because there was this person talking about the concerns that I had in the world as a coder, and it felt like, wow, somebody noticed what I am and what I do and thought it mattered. And then, of course, I watched what Joel and his co-founder Michael and their incredible teams had done over the years, and they built Stack Overflow, which Tristan did an incredible job of sort of outlining earlier. I was sort of like, wow, I'm on the board of Stack Overflow, and I was like, I didn't know some of this stuff. So that's good. That's like there's this whole practice built around it. And they built Trello. They built all these things, and that was remarkable. And I think that's what most people know Joel for, and that whole team for having done these days. But what stood out to me, as somebody who was writing code every day, not very well, I was never a great coder to my chagrin, was that Joel also created a test. And this was it really started as a blog post, but it later became sort of a whole framework for how he built several of his companies. And it was this idea that there was a set of practices by which you could define whether an organization cared about its programmers, cared about them having the resources they needed, cared about them having the infrastructure they needed to be successful. And it was simple things like, do you have a monitor that's big enough for you to have your app and your window up, your editor window next to each other? And it was more complicated things, like at the time, did you use version control? Now, granted, back then version control was like SVN, so it was a much more painful experience than it is these days. But even that was better than the every once in a while I zip files up and email them to myself, which was the state of the art in a lot of organizations. And so by creating this list that he called the Joel test of things that would indicate an organization cared about whether programmers could succeed within their walls, he made a standard. And it was something that organizations started to share with each other, coders started to share with each other, and had a real transformative effect, almost too successful, because now coders are probably the most privileged workers in the history of the world, so like we could dial it down a little bit. We don't need to have quite as many free massages and snacks all the time, but like there was a sort of a balance there where they went from under-respected to very, very, very respected in a short period of time, and in no small part because there was a clear declaration of a standard to which all the people in that community should be served. And that was striking to me because actually, as Matthew mentioned, I joined a company that was making blogging tools back then, and my title over the course of a couple of years shifted, but eventually became Chief Evangelist, or VP of Evangelism. And I picked that title because I had created a developer network and was in charge of developer relations at a time when that was sort of being fairly lost in the woods. You could not fill, even in San Francisco, where I was at the time, a room this big with people that had that as their primary responsibility. And I looked back at companies that had done it. As mentioned, Apple was one of the sort of pioneers, and at that time, Guy Kawasaki was the only person I'd known who'd had the title Evangelist on his business cards. And of course, his track record has been there at the time when Apple went from industry darling to are they going to survive? And so it seemed to me like Evangelist was not always a title that was necessarily effective at growing the business, but that it was something that sounded pretty cool. And so I took it. And for me, it was because the work was important. It was interesting. I had, and this is going to date me, when I started being a professional coder, I coded pretty much my whole life, but when I started doing it for a living, I used to get MSDN, the Microsoft Developer Network, delivered as a print newspaper to my office every 2 weeks, occasionally accompanied by floppy disks, later upgraded to CD-ROMs. I'm that old. And it was still insightful. And so I thought, wow, developer networks can really make a big difference. I'm going to create one of those. And that work grew, eventually to working with my peers in other companies at Google, which was not nearly as big back then, and other companies like that, to create what we were trying to hope for would be a shared API, shared standard between all the tools that we were building. We succeeded in creating a very complex, elaborate, inscrutable XML API right at the moment as REST APIs took over. That succeeded as well as you might imagine. But one of the useful things that did come out of that process was I found a community. I found a community of peers, and it was 5, 10 of us that could fit around a table. I mean, we could all have dinner together. But I found people that cared about building relationships with developers. And it seemed like there was this common thread where we understood, even if we couldn't quite articulate it, that creating this community was really, really meaningful and really resonant and would have significance because we were affecting the developers that were shaping so much of what happened around us. And interestingly, the company I was at the time was very design-driven, very forward-thinking about these kinds of practices that I think today are very standard. And I saw our design team and the people in that community hashing out, like, what we're going to call it, user experience or user interface or interaction design or information architecture. And these titles were actually very fuzzy, very ill-defined at the time. But they spent a few years, and people wrote a lot of blog posts. They made a lot of diagrams. They're good at diagrams. They're designers. And they put it all together, and they sort of said, you're in this bucket, and we're in this bucket, and this is how the workflow goes between what we do, and we start to define who it is that does each step of the process. And the interesting thing that came out of that I noticed was all of a sudden, we had VPs of design. We had venture capitalists talking about we're going to fund a design-based firm, or a design-based fund, sorry, to have a design-first practice for some of these companies and these startups that we're going to invest in. And they started to really take design seriously because designers took it seriously. They sort of demanded this is how we organize ourselves and how we see our practice evolving and how we make the business case and the argument for what we do. And at the time, of course, with our community, we had all these wild different titles. Some of us were doing evangelism, some were doing DevRel, some of us called ourselves developer advocates. But I knew that would settle out very quickly. There's no way that we would get past 2005 or so without sorting out these titles and all coming to the conclusion that there was one name that would describe the practice. And we arrived at it this morning when Aaron revealed to us that we were all applied epistemologists. But the interesting thing to me was I loved doing the work. I really loved, after a while I got tired of quite so many airline miles, but other than that, I really liked the work. I loved meeting people. I loved talking about the code. I loved learning about how people would use the technology and they could invent new applications for the platforms we'd created. It felt like a revelation. Like, you're showing to me what my work means is some of the joy of DevRel. And I wanted to move forward with it. And after a few years of thinking about that, and even at that organization where I had been very senior, I was the first employee hired after the founders, I'd been had a lot of access and a lot of influence on product roadmap and things like that. The only way for me to move forward, even with a DevRel title that was pretty much as senior as it could get, was to move out. There was no future for me, even having as much power and control and influence as I could within that organization. And with a product that was successful, with a platform that was interesting, there was no future for me in DevRel except to look elsewhere, to marketing, to sales, to product, to engineering, to the things that I was interested in, but that weren't what had made me motivated in the first place. Let's fast forward a decade or two, about 15 years, from when this story starts to much closer to today, about a year ago. I ended up getting asked to become CEO of Fog Creek Software. Joel and Michael, the founders, had a lot of success with Stack Overflow and Trello, and each had gone to go and run those companies. And they said, we still have this company that's making interesting things, and we think you could be a steward for what it is, which to me felt a bit like when Rob Halford left Judas Priest, and the guy who was in the cover band the singer got to actually be in the real band, and he got pulled on stage. I was like, wow, like, this is pretty exciting. Also, I'm not qualified for this, but I'll try it. Don't get mad if I screw it up. And, in those interceding years, I thought I had sort of learned, how the world works. I had gotten the skills to get to be in a seat like CEO, to have that sort of title. But in particular, I was struck by what the team had created, at Fall Creek before I joined. I mean, this work was sort of done, but for telling the story, where they had built these incredible platforms like Glitch. How many of you know about Glitch or have seen it and checked it out? That's awesome. That makes me very excited. They made Manuscript, which is like Jira, but it doesn't make you want to cry. That's the tagline. We're going to put that on the website. And Gareth's here. I could actually ask you to do that, but whatever. And it was such a compelling legacy, but I was curious about what was going to come next. And in particular, I looked at Glitch and I just thought this is something remarkable. It's just it brought to me the fun of when I had the early web, when you could just sort of view source on like a GeoCities page and hack it together and make something cool and feel like I made something and I can show it to someone. And this is what I loved about the web. This was what the promise of being a developer was about to me. And especially because as you sort of get further down the road on being a developer and moving into these other roles in an organization, a lot of times the only time you can code is like late at night after all your actual work is done. And I always felt like by the time my son was in bed and I, done the dishes or whatever else, I had enough time to set up a dev environment, and then I'd have to go to bed before I could actually code the thing that I had in my head. And to sort of restore some of that ability to create was really powerful. And so I saw what the team had made, and I said, I'm in. I want to join this company. I want to work on this project. And I think the expected thing we were going to do with a tool like Glitch, where people are coding together and you're sort of running the apps, was you would make something like a new version of Heroku, right? You would do a hosting service and you would sort of host people's apps and hope that was how you built a business. And I think that was the easy path and the expected path, and not at all what we've done. Maybe it would be easier than what we're doing. And I thought about what the right thing is to do, which is we've got this tool that's special, and it's a place that people feel like they can collaborate together and create together. And the right thing to do was to go back to this unsolved problem, which was that I think all of us know really deeply developers shape culture, right? I mean, you can phrase this as software is eating the world. There's a million different ways to say this, but what we look at that's incontrovertibly true is that choices we make in software really matter. When we see developers, something as straightforward as we used to think about how to represent somebody's gender in an app, and that used to be a radio button with two choices of male and female, and say, you know what, there's such a wide world that we can make this an open-ended text field and just accommodate everyone instead of being convenient to our own preferences or our laziness as developers, and simply indicate to somebody that they belong in this app, in this community, as much as we do. And those little choices we made in our software were sort of revealing our values. And when we realize everything, like every pixel on the screen, every drop-down choice in a menu reflects culture, then the role that we have as people that care about relating to developers and supporting them becomes even more important. The stakes are suddenly much, much higher. And then I thought, well, if we've got the chance where we're building tools that people happen to like, then serving that need is the most important mission we can have. And especially because this is happening in every organization. I mean, so much of the conversation focuses on public-facing APIs and the sort of very visible startups that have a lot of resources to invest into DevRel. But every organization has some surface area they're exposing through technology, whether that's an internal API or a B2B interface or something that is for developers out in the world. This is sort of how they are saying this is the way to interact with our organization, with our institution. And so this becomes a very, very pervasive need. And I realized if we're going to do justice to that, it would make sense to go back to first principles, which is how do you raise the bar and raise the standard for a community when their work has not been sufficiently respected? Because interestingly to me, when I spent that time in San Francisco in the startup world, and it wasn't the scene for me, but I got to meet a lot of people and see a lot of interesting things happen. And I saw when GitHub was a weekend project from two guys that were in the community. And I said, that looks interesting. And I saw, the very first version of the Stripe homepage, and there was a curl command on the homepage. And I thought, that's new, that's different. And seeing the first version of Twilio and saying, why isn't this harder? Because isn't this supposed to be a lot harder? This is really easy. And each of those was a blip. It didn't register to me at the time. This is a milestone in this greater practice of what we're doing. But over time, as we started to understand, it's great. These are ways to do documentation. These are ways to do examples. What we didn't have was a way to make each of these organizations and institutions care deeply about the practice of DevRel. But what if we could set a standard in the ways that designers had done for their practice, in the ways that I'd seen Joel do for developers themselves, that we could set a standard for what DevRel was. And it, my trepidation about this was it felt a little presumptuous for, one, me to be the one to write it, and two, to call it a Bill of Rights. But I'm an American, and the Brits here will know we're sort of insufferable. And I decided, there isn't going to be a right person, a qualified person. There isn't going to be a perfect person. There's just going to be whoever shows up, because that's how community works. That's how DevRel works. And so we would put out something imperfect and imprecise as a starting point to hopefully galvanize a conversation. And there's actually, if you look on our Twitter account or Facebook account, you'll be able to see where we've linked to this Bill of Rights. But I want to run through just a couple of the points real quickly, and I'm not going to sort of recite the thing at length, but I think some of the points are less obvious or were harder learned lessons that took a lot of time for me to get why they mattered, and took me going on this path to leaving the discipline and coming back before I understood their importance. So the first point was a clear set of business goals. And this sounds obvious, but so much of the time, DevRel is this opportunistic hire that an organization makes. Is like, we're supposed to have DevRel now. Let's go get one. And they leave goals underdefined. And what happens is the people in the position cannot win. There's no way to say, well, I achieved what you asked me to achieve, because there hasn't been that clarity of goals. And so this is such a straightforward, simple request to make. And this was one of the first things I thought of, because I thought, if I can give you a tool where you can say, well, this one company that's been around for 17 years wrote this list, and can we just check this first thing off the list? Radically increases the chances that the work you do will be something that persists in time, and the position you have will be one that grows in time. The second was a well-defined place in the organization. How many of you, your job is DevRel, Dev Evangelism, Dev Advocacy? Right? Almost everybody. How many of you report into an engineering or product team? Right? About a third, maybe. How many into marketing? Yeah. What are some other teams that you connect into? Sales, right? How many into sales? Just a few. How many of you, none of those? Yeah. How many of you don't know? You don't have to put your hand up. That was me for a long time. I was like this, we had, that thing they do in org charts, well, you have a dotted line into this person. I had all dotted lines. There were no solid lines. And which is sort of the way of saying that you're a hot potato. Nobody wants to sort of be responsible for you. But especially nobody wants to carry your budget, right? You're a cost. And nobody's like, I would like to volunteer for the cost of this person or team whose goals are ill-defined, right? There's no way to win there. And so to demand, I want to know who my boss is and who I report to is not an unreasonable request. And to say that their budget is accountable to us for these items is not an unreasonable request. So let's set the bar at least that high, although that's not very high. A structured way to impact product and platform. This was sort of very carefully chosen wording here. And this was that sometimes you will be part of a product team. Sometimes you'll be part of a platform team. But whether you are or not, when you go out to an event, when you talk to somebody on a forum, on Stack Overflow, out in the community, on social media, and they say, we need your platform to do X, Y, and Z, and you believe them because you've heard that 100 more times before, for you to be able to take that back to the product team and have them hear you and acknowledge you, and maybe they'll close your Jira ticket, but they had to have seen you and said to you, we're not doing that right now. Have a process that matters. It matters. It's the basic level of respect for this role. And so often we're trying to sort of beg, borrow, and steal. We're using soft power, right? Well, I hope if I just have enough meetings and I wear them down and they hear me complain about the fact that our API is broken in this place, they'll finally fix it. They will not. That's the answer. They won't. It's not because they're bad people. Maybe they are, but mostly they're not. It's not because they have bad intent. It's because the process hasn't been defined, and when it's undefined, you cannot win, right? And I look again at the analog of a marketing team, a sales team, right? How do they interface with product, right? Think about, and then, we don't have to emulate sales in every way, but you think about salespeople, eventually, they bang that drum loud enough, they get the feature they want, or something that scratches that itch, that appeases their demand there. And we should be able to expect at least that same level of accommodation. This is my mastery of word rap. The open lines of communication and marketing, I think is so key. There's something interesting about the fact that many, many times DevRel does either report or dotted line report into marketing. Most often, what we find is that's where you have to beg for budget from. And yet, if you say, well, we want to know what your schedule is of the stories you're about to tell, what are the narratives we're doing? How do we make sure that DevRel is incorporated in the center of what you're doing, as opposed to, at the very end, let's sprinkle some DevRel on it, which tends to happen. This is about planting that flag as well. And in talking to a lot of you, one of the things I sort of want to reflect back is nobody thinks this is working great. I don't mean that in a negative way, but nobody thinks, marketing really is totally in sync with me, and they ask us first, and they build DevRel into the center of their message. Not one organization. I hope there's exceptions here. I hope I'm wrong. But for the most part, almost no organization that I've talked to has the DevRel team said, we are top of mind when marketing is making decisions about audiences they want to communicate with, or about who they treat as authoritative in crafting their messages. This will change. This can change, but today that's where we're at. And this one's near and dear to my heart. The right tools designed for the job. I'm struck by, having sort of done my time in marketing and sales in these other teams. You look at sales and the level of detail and measurement and metrics of what people do on those teams. You can tell when somebody takes a coffee break on a sales team by looking at the spreadsheets and the output and the reports from Salesforce or whatever they're using, right? And the marketing team has HubSpot, and they know how many e-commerce abandons happen in the cart. They've got this down to the 100th of a decimal point detail over what they're doing. And then you look at DevRel practice, and we're just guessing, just throwing darts at the wall, right? Just sort of saying, how many people tried our API today? Well, some, right? How many of them succeeded? A bunch. And that's a hard way to work. And this is where, honestly, I have the most self-criticism. This is where we're our own worst enemies, about giving every other department ammunition to say theirs is the budget to cut. DevRel is the one that should be cut. And why? What have they shown? Where's their numbers, right? Is it up and to the right? Is it flat? And you say there's no numbers at all? It's well, that's a tough argument to make. And the interesting thing is, marketing teams that are good, they can show a number going down and it's not headed the right way, and they're like, well, let me tell you why. I'll tell you a good story about it. And they'll still make the case for why. I always joke sort of marketing is like policing is in the U.S. If crime is going up, you need more police, but if crime is going down, you need more police. And sort of marketing sort of works the same way. And I don't want us to be, always saying DevRel just has to get more and more money, but I think there is a way to say, let's defend getting resources based on metrics and measurement. And then a couple of things which actually we've had a great conversation about today that I'm going to go through quickly. One is explicit ethical and social guidelines, just setting the rules, putting them in writing. The same reason we have a code of conduct in our communities and in our code. It's such a powerful tool to be able to do the right thing. I've been really inspired and heartened by seeing how many of you have given voice to this and articulated this today and in your work, but making sure that that's on the list. Similarly, support for building inclusive communities. This is money, right? This is resources. This is flying to the people that you want to reach, flying the people that you need to reach to your events, being able to invest in actually doing outreach as opposed to we held an event and they didn't show up and why didn't they? This stuff, I think a lot of you have become, as all of us have, much more fluent in the past several years in what's needed to do this. But being able to say, this is part of the work. Without this, you cannot succeed at doing the work, or the work will be compromised, is something that I think we've, as a community, gotten a lot better at, and we can support each other in sort of fighting for. This is the one that I get the most positive feedback on, but it's all in DMs. Nobody wants to say it publicly. Distinction from sales engineering. Sales engineering is a noble profession, an important and valuable one. It is different to DevRel. It's different. It's different. Now, maybe you work closely with them. Maybe you have some fluidity in smaller teams where people switch back and forth between those roles. But being clear about what those boundaries are, and especially because compensation is different. There are people that like to do sales engineering because they like to be compensated like a sales team is. Sometimes it's a whole different structure. Being able to set those boundaries is critical to succeeding. If you don't define this, the sales team will treat you as de facto sales engineering. Why? Because they can, because they have metrics and they actually have a budget. And so this is one of the things where it just is about getting it in writing, making it clear, setting expectations, and being able to move forward. Resources for your professional development. Right? What we do so much of the time in DevRel is help others develop their professional skills, which is great. But events like this, which is a rare and special treat, are where we get better at the practice of what we do. There aren't too many of them. It's not like we could go to one every week. And so being able to ask for time, resource, and that commitment to be able to do so is really valuable. The good news is all of you are on the right side of this because you're here. What we have to think about is our peers who tried to make the case for being at events like this one and couldn't make it. And then finally, most importantly, is this connection to a community of peers. This is this idea that there is something special about being in a room with other people who understand what we do. Most of the time, DevRel is a very solitary role in an organization. It's a very small team. Maybe it's one person. Almost none of the other people in the organization understand what it is that you do. And that's especially acute because to want to do this role, you're probably a people person. You're somebody that's social. You like to talk to people. That's why you do the job. And so if you think of a community of people who are very social, like communicating with each other, and work in organizations where they almost certainly will not have someone to talk to about what they do, what's the likely outcome of that scenario? The only way it doesn't end in a lot of unhappiness and a lot of frustration is if we're all connected to one another. That's why these are vitally important events for us to be like this in real space, in virtual space, all the time. And most importantly, because I think about that challenge I had of moving forward, where I thought the only way in the past that I could have a future in DevRel was to leave it. And it was frustrating. It was, frankly, depressing. I just couldn't believe that something that was this rewarding and satisfying had as its only path forward to leave the practice and hope that somebody else would pick up the ball. And also that it couldn't be that the only other option was, well, I could stay at DevRel, but at the expense of the ambitions of my career or curtailing what my potential would be within the organization. And what I realized is that there is a potential to take some of these principles that have come from all of us together, coming with the ideas that form this Bill of Rights. And possibly, if we all push forward with them together, we'll be able to elevate the practice, get the rest of our organizations, the rest of our industry to see this as a professional and serious trade, that there's a chance that there's a future for all of us to stay in this practice together and have no limits to what we achieve. Thank you.